From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, and I have the wonderful job of being associated with and working with books and reading on behalf of the Library of Congress. The center was created by Daniel Boorstin when he was Librarian of Congress in 1977 to try to stimulate public interest in books and reading. There now are affiliated centers working at the grassroots level in every state, and together we sponsor book events and try to remind people of the importance of books and reading in our culture. Today, with our Books and Beyond talk about a sparkling new, formidable, and well-reviewed book, biography of Ralph Ellison, you are experiencing just one of the ways that we are able to promote books here at the Library of Congress. Before we start, I have a couple of things to mention. We will hear from Professor Rampersad, and then we will talk about the book. We then will have the, I'm sorry, I mispronounced his name. Rampersad. I'm sorry, Arnold. I'm sorry about that. Rampersad, sorry. We will hear from Professor Rampersad. We will then have a book signing following and have a chance before that to have questions and answers. We hope you will have questions. We know that our professor has answers. But if you ask a question, you are actually giving us permission to use your image and your words on the videotape which is being made for this talk. All of the Center for the Book's book talks are available in cybercast form on our website, and this one will join them. Also, I would like to remind you to please turn off all beepers, anything related to radio, a BlackBerry, a cell phone, so we can not bother the recording and get a good audio tape of today's book talk. The Center for the Book is connected with, of course, books in many, many ways, but it's a special pleasure to be connected with different divisions of the Library of Congress as we present these book talks. Our co-sponsor today is the Manuscript Division. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to present Alice Burney, who is the American literature specialist for the Manuscript Division, to say a word or two about the Ellison papers and her experience in helping Professor Rampersad. Alice?
Good afternoon. About a year after Ralph Ellison died, I had the privilege of going to New York, to Harlem, to visit with the widow, who was still very much in grief at the time. The purpose of my trip was to supervise the packing of the entire Ralph Ellison archive, which was coming to the Library of Congress. That is, books, manuscripts, and audiovisual elements. I had the opportunity at that time to have my first experience in Ralph Ellison criticism, and it came from one of the book packers who was standing at the top of a ladder in the Ellison living room with a bunch of books in his hand, handing them down, and he observed, "Well, Mark Twain must have been Ralph Ellison's favorite author. There are a lot of copies of Mark Twain's books here." And that was my first experience with a New York critic. Since then, and in the years since then, I've had many encounters with researchers who are using the collection for books, articles, dissertations, many, many dissertations, on many different aspects of Ralph Ellison's life. The collection was organized in 1997, and in last year, the register was revised, and I have that here later for anyone who wants to look at it. It's 68 pages, just for the manuscripts. There are 46,000 items in the manuscript section, in 253 archival containers, with more to come. The rare books division has the Ellison library. Some of it is on display. And the prints and photographs division holds the photographs by and of Ellison. He was a photographer. Because of the restrictions imposed on parts of the collection by the literary executor, I've had unusual contact with researchers one-on-one in order to guide their research interests properly and formulate their requests. And many of them have had been granted access to parts of the collection. But only one person was granted access to the entire collection in order to create his meticulous biography, and that was Professor Arnold Rampersad. John?
Thank you, Alice. It's a special pleasure to be able to honor a book that has come out of the collections of the Library of Congress, and that is the case here. Arnold Rampersad is Sara Hart Kimball Professor in the Humanities and a member of the English Department at Stanford University. He is a specialist in, I would say, both biography, but also stories of African Americans. He has written biographies of Langston Hughes and Jackie Robinson, and he collaborated with Arthur Ashe in his memoir, Days of Grace. He has written for the New York Times Book Review, the New Republic, and the Washington Post. He's an elected member of the American Academy and the American Philosophical Society. He has a nice introduction to how he got interested in Ralph Ellison in the book. And if you are interested in that, I hope that you will purchase a copy and also get the book signed and have a chance to chat with Arnold Rampersad. It is my pleasure now to present the author of this, as Alice said, meticulous new biography of Ralph Ellison, Arnold Rampersad. Arnold?
Thank you very, very much. I am absolutely delighted to be here. When you put in an awful lot of time in, I'm trying to think if there are seats for the people who are standing. I see there's one empty seat here, and but perhaps I should leave that to others. When you spend a lot of time, say, at the Biography Library or here, you know, you view the places with a mixture of affection and a certain amount of dread, because it's hard work being a biographer. People say, well, "What are you going to work on next?" I said, I can't work on it. I'm tired. I'm too old. I can't. Doing a biography is very, very time consuming. But I do absolutely love the Library of Congress. I love the Madison building. As I came in. I'm an emotional sort. So forgive me if I came in and I stood outside the reading room, looking through the glass, and I felt pure pleasure, because for me, there are few things more exciting than being brought a tray of books, not books rather, but letters or original documents, and going through them and trying to find material that is of compelling interest that you can then include in a biography. The librarians were, starting with Dr. Alice Burney, were absolutely wonderful. Adrian Cannon, also very, very helpful. And the librarians and the people who took the slips and brought the material also. This place has the tightest security of any of any library I've worked with, but paradoxically, it is the easiest library I've ever worked in. It like that, you know, people, they understand what scholarship is about, and what learning is about, and respect for books is about, and it just shows. It just shows. So I'm very grateful. I'm very glad to be here. How did I come to write this book? I'm supposed to speak for 30 minutes. I will try to stick to that limit. How did I come to write this book? Well, I'd never thought of writing a biography of Ralph Ellison, although he had loomed large in my life as a professor of literature, as a teacher, as a scholar, as a general reader. Two publishers approached me and asked me whether I would write a biography of Ellison, and I said no. I was working on something else at the time, but also I think there was some sense on my part that it was not the subject for me, especially after I had done a 2-volume biography of Langston Hughes, and I knew from first hand that Ralph Ellison had nothing but contempt for Hughes as a writer and as a poet. But then another, or perhaps one of the two persisted a few months later, and I said, well, I will find out from John Callahan, professor at Lewis and Clark, who had emerged as a literary, what is the term? Literary executor, actual or certainly he was Mrs. Ellison's principal advisor in literary matters. And I asked him if he intended to write a biography. He said he had absolutely no interest in writing the biography. Well, have you allowed anyone else? Are you championing anyone else to write the biography? No, we have no one on the horizon. And then he says, but it would be nice if you would write the biography. So I thought about it. I examined my calendar, and I discovered that the whole coming decade was free. So signed a formal agreement with Mrs. Ellison and her lawyers, in which I was granted full access to the papers. It was not to be an authorized biography. This was spelled out. This was their idea, but I myself would never have wanted to write an authorized biography. I suggested to them, and they readily agreed, that there be a clause that said that I had to show them the manuscript and respond to their comments before I published it, but they could not affect what I published finally. They could not demand changes, in other words. And armed with that agreement, I set out to write the biography of Ralph Ellison. I was looking recently at the agreement itself, and something struck me as amusing. I said, I do not intend, this is actually not an agreement, this is a proposal I made to Alfred A. Knopf, through my editor, Jonathan Siegel there, and to Sunny Mehta, the head of Knopf. I do not intend to write mainly an intellectual biography. At every point I hope to emphasize the personal core of the life, while attempting to do justice to the range of Ellison's intellectual and artistic interests and achievements, which of course cannot be divorced from the person. And this is the amusing part, at least it amuses me in hindsight. Frankly, there is little that appears to be sensational about the texture of Ellison's private life. His first marriage ended quickly, but his second endured. He left no children. Still, Ellison is one of the important American literary figures of this century, and the importance of his example and also of his ideas about the fluidity of American culture seems only to grow, even as his only novel, persists, in my opinion, as one of the grander achievements in American literary history. Well, I wasn't far into the papers when, especially the private papers, the family papers, when I realized that I was wrong about the absence of the sensational. Not sensational in the sense of say, R.W.B. Lewis's biography of Edith Wharton, where he includes an unknown, unexpected pornographic story that certainly expanded our understanding of the range of Miss Wharton's interests in life. But nevertheless, sensational. There was the sensational in Ellison's life especially when one considers the veneer or patina of circumspection, of command and control that he seemed to epitomize. In many respects, he is the grandest, the most aloof, the most Olympian figure in 20th century American literature. Although finally he would be eclipsed in importance and in honors by Toni Morrison, and that in fact is part of the story. As Cornel West told me in an airport one morning, the Madison airport in Wisconsin, Cornel West greatly admires the work of Ralph Ellison, thinks him indispensable, regrets, however, that he says that he was such an American super patriot. More of that later. But he also said to me something that was that's very, very telling. He says, you know, what Ellison reminds me of what T.S. Eliot said about Matthew Arnold in 1933. There's a line there that I think applies to Ellison. T.S. Eliot said about Matthew Arnold, "He had no real serenity, only an impeccable demeanor." And in a sense, my task as a biographer was to push past the impeccable demeanor to see what was the cause of the absence of real serenity, to push past the veneer of command and the reality of a certain kind of command and Olympian control that Ellison seemed to epitomize so much. Well, the most frequently asked question about Ralph Ellison, as I went from pillar to post doing the biography, is why didn't he publish a second novel? 42 years passed between the appearance of Invisible Man in 1952 and his death in 1994. Ellison was certainly one of the most egregious slowpokes in American writing. His competition, people like Henry Roth, whose novel Call It Sleep was followed by such a long, long silence that it could very well have been called Call It Coma. Answering that question, though, about why Ralph was unable to, I'll call him Ralph, was unable to write a second novel, consumes often in covert ways the second half of the book. But equally important to me, really, perhaps even more important, if seldom asked, is the question, how did Ellison come to write a book as sophisticated, as complex, and possibly as timeless as Invisible Man, given his background, which I will go into? How did he do it, given his late start as a writer? And Richard Wright, who really got him started as a writer, said, you're starting too late. You cannot start to be a writer at 24. Given his late start as a writer, the weakness of his formal education, although some people would say, oh, he had a good formal education at Tuskegee, that is, I think, simply untrue. His entrapment by a communist aesthetic during his first years trying to be a writer, starting around 1937-38. He was writing for New Masses and other magazines, and he was following the communist aesthetic as a critic and also as a fiction writer. He had to emancipate himself from that. How did he come to? What accounted for the extraordinary effort, the commitment to writing, the relentless commitment to the production of a superior kind of fictional art that would result in 1945 in that epiphanic moment when the idea comes into his head to begin a novel. I am an invisible man, and he finds his voice. I mean, when you read his early stories, you do not think this person, you're entitled to think that this person will never achieve any kind of artistic or intellectual prominence. But in fact, by that time, by 45, Ellison had made himself into, I was pretty close to a first-class intellectual, had given himself to a cosmopolitan conception of the intellectual life, and had trained himself in a way that is outside of the university, and perhaps that's where the best training is done. That we can only look upon. I look upon with a measure of awe. It certainly became clear. It soon became clear, certainly too, that I was dealing with an extraordinarily complicated man, one haunted by a powerful sense of family pride, except that the sense of pride was tainted when he was growing up as a boy and later as an adolescent by an overwhelming element of frustration, denial, loss, and rage. Ellison once wrote about how close he came to killing people. He said he had to stop at one point and realize that he was now strong enough and angry enough that he might kill somebody. But the volcanic energy, anger was in him, I think, to the very end. So there was no real serenity. James Baldwin, I think, called him the angriest man in America, even though he seemed to be anything but that. Albert Murray, his very, very close friend, also, you didn't want to meddle with Ralph Ellison. And there are rumors of his having pulled knives on various people, notably Chester Himes, although he himself denies that it ever took place. place. And Norman Mailer, in Advertisements for Myself, called him, quote, essentially a hateful writer. And I could only, I was so overwhelmed, stunned by that remark, that little section of Advertisements for Myself, because I said to myself, how could Mailer, without his such little knowledge of Ellison, I mean, they had met, and each one disliked the other, but how could he penetrate like that to certain truths about Ellison? Well, I think that is the nature of genius, and we have. I don't use that term loosely. I'm using it now in a broader sense about both Mailer and about Ellison. But this quality, this idea of him there being a hateful quality, quality in his writing. We need not take that as gospel truth, but what Mailer was saying is that you can see in the writing the volcanic rage underneath it. Well, let's move on. Family pride had to do with the achievements, I would say, especially during Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction of his father's family, especially his father's father, who during Reconstruction held a position that gave him authority over whites. He was respected, but when whites took over control of South Carolina, he was thrown out of office. But there was a legacy of a position of authority. There was a large of decaying house. And there was a certain amount of education, I think, passed on to Ralph's father. And all that was in the past. And that was the foundation of Ralph's family pride and the pride his mother warned him about. His mother warned him. She said, you could go far in life perhaps, but you have to watch out for that Ellison pride. And I think that pride persisted to the end of his life. And it helped him, and it also hurt him. I think it was part of the reason why he was not able to finish that second novel, because his standards had become so Olympian. One reason was his standards had become so Olympian that he was not prepared to do what some of his heroes were prepared to do, which is to write great novels, but also to write inferior stuff, and to realize that the career can tail off. No, he always wanted to write, a superior. A novel superior to Invisible Man. Indeed, in an interview for the Paris Review in 1954, he kind of dismisses Invisible Man. He says I failed of eloquence. The language wasn't good enough. Well, it's a fantastic novel, and for you to speak about it pejoratively in that way is you're asking for trouble if you think that you're going to easily surpass such what is I think a masterpiece. Oklahoma, he lives there until 1933. He's born in 1913, although he offered 1914 as the true year of his birth. The most destructive element for Ralph, the shaping moment, is the death of his father when Lewis Ellison, in 1916, when Ralph himself was 3 years old. For some years, Ellison lived thinking of himself as a member of one of the most prosperous black families in the city, the Randolphs, the household of Jefferson Davis Randolph he was born into, even as his mother sank quickly, I would say, in the social world and ended up mainly as a hotel maid in and out of jobs, working at the Biltmore Hotel in Oklahoma City and elsewhere, a job that absolutely humiliated her son on a daily basis. He lived a kind of ordered life in Douglas High School with good teachers, especially a woman named Zelia Breaux, who was the director of music for the colored schools of Oklahoma City. He became a trumpeter, and he became leader of the student band and so on. There was this sense of order and of some prestige, authority, and so on. But then you go home to the mother who is working as a maid and who cannot give him all the things that he wants. Most of them, almost all of them, are material things. I need a jacket, I need a shirt, I need clean this, and so on. And she's struggling to do her best. Ralph undoubtedly loved his mother, but there is evidence if you wanted to say he hated his mother. He loved his father. He persisted in his interest in his father. but he had no interest in his mother's family that I can detect. When he erected, late in life, he erected a tombstone over his father's grave. It said, "Father of the two sons," and she was never mentioned. When he dedicated Invisible Man, people thought he had dedicated it to his mother, whose name was Ida, but in fact it was not Ida Ellison. It was Ida Espen Guggenheimer, to whom the book was dedicated. Nor was it dedicated to his wife, incidentally. So he is unable for 2 years after high school to find a college to go to. Finally, when he goes to Tuskegee, more frustration. He wants to be in the music school. He wants to work with William Levi Dawson, but he cannot afford the music school, which is anomalous at Tuskegee because Tuskegee was supposed to be a school that emphasized the practical. And in fact, the music school was closed down not long after Ellison left. He achieved a certain standing on the campus again because of his musical ability. He was leader of the student orchestra. I think they had about 3 orchestras. He was probably the number one person in that respect. But again, the poverty, the grinding poverty that took a particularly lethal form when it came up against the, as Ralph puts it, the homosexual desires of certain people on the campus who had the authority to hand out jobs that he desperately needed, and who insisted on certain favors. He said in a letter to Richard Wilbur, the great poet, late in his life and great friend of Ralph's, he said, that I was hounded out of Tuskegee by a homosexual dean. That's part of the story, but I think it is important. Again, so you have Tuskegee, his formal education, and it's exciting. He learns a lot, especially in his junior year. He spends 3 years there when he is introduced to the English novel. When he comes to New York in 1936, he has given up music. He knows he will never be a great musician. He takes up a sculpture briefly and tries to work with Augusta Savage, but then he turns towards writing much later on. But what set him on course, I think, for accepting the burden of the writer is a course he takes in the novel, especially the English novel, from one of his teachers at Tuskegee, Morteza Drexel Sprague, a young black graduate of an elite northern institution. And there, reading Jude the Obscure in particular, and some other books, just a whole world opens to him, a world of possibility, and he turns towards literature. By this point, he has an ingrained despisal of sociology in particular, sociology with its arrogance about people based on statistics, as he saw it. He had no respect for W.B. Du Bois. He had no respect for a lot of the sociologists of the time, especially for the way they used statistics in order to belittle, as far as Ralph was concerned, black people. Then came New York in 1936. He was supposed to be going there to spend the summer, make money, go back home, go back to Tuskegee, finish his college. But once he got there, he never went back. I think pretty soon he knew he would not be going back. And the second day, in the YMCA lobby on 135th Street, he meets Langston Hughes in the company of Alan Locke. And Hughes becomes his great friend, helps him for the next several years of his life. But that did not make Ellison any more charitable towards Hughes as an artist and eventually as a man. The year afterwards, explicitly through Hughes, another act of classic generosity on Hughes's part. Hughes writes to Richard Wright saying, "I hear you're coming to New York. There's a young man here, pretty talented, wants to meet you. Make sure you meet him." And so he meets Richard Wright, and that becomes a binding friendship. And Wright is on the cusp, on the brink of achieving prominence with Uncle Tom's Children, and then in 1940 with the sensational bestseller, A Native Son. And Ralph, in a sense, apprentices himself to Richard Wright. Wright is the person who says, "I'm helping to edit New Challenge. Would you write a review, a book review?" He'd never thought of publishing a book review before. And then he said, "Nice review. Would you do a short story?" He had never thought of writing before. And although it was not published until after his death, that first story ignited, this a train of fire in his being, and he, from that point on, determined to be a writer. So 1937-38, a particularly interesting year. His mother dies. He knows that his mother is very, very sick. He learns that she is really failing. He makes a sacrifice. He sells his trumpet, which he has no more use for, and he doesn't give the money to his mother. No, he makes sure that her insurance policy is paid up when she, so that he and his brother would get some money when she dies. I say these things and they sound a bit cruel, but you have to recognize at the same time that he did love his mother. But he was a complicated man, as I think you're beginning to see. I hope you're beginning to see. Between 37 and 42, he is tied up in the Communist Party. Wright is a communist. He begins to write for new masses. They welcome him as a black writer because converting the black masses to communism is one of the principal goals of the party. But Wright, a series of events leads many people to leave, to leave the party, to look quizzically at the Communist Party, and he is part of that exodus. Wright breaks openly. Ellison, who has fewer resources, breaks quietly. In fact, for a while, even though he had ceased to believe in communism, he continued to write, including under an assumed name, to write reviews from a communist perspective. But in 1942, by his own accounting, he makes he takes a grand turn in his life, and he dedicates himself. He repudiates quietly the communist aesthetic and philosophy, and he dedicates himself to broadly humanistic learning, cultural production, cosmopolitanism, a reverence for high culture. He's influenced by Kenneth Burke and by Burke's mentee, a man named Stanley Edgar Hyman, who taught at Bennington, and without whose help, I think, Invisible Man would never have been written. In fact, and somebody has speculated, the reason the second novel was never written is that there was no Stanley Edgar Hyman around to lick the novel into shape in a way, in part because Hyman had died, but more importantly, I think, because Ralph had reached such a conception of himself that he could no longer submit his art to the examination and chastisement of critics, as we all are obliged to do. He establishes a pantheon of writers. Who he considers his ancestors, as he writes about them, in fact, as opposed to his relatives. His relatives are people like Langston Hughes, like Richard Wright, maybe Count de Cullen. His ancestors, however, are Dostoevsky above all, and of course that's immediately present. You can see in Invisible Man. Mark Twain, he sees him as a grand figure. He would agree with Hemingway that I think that all of American literature comes out of Huckleberry Finn. T.S. Eliot, he reads The Wasteland, Eliot's book-length poem of 1922, and he sees in it, he says, for the first time in literature, a reflection of the quality of improvisation that is so important in jazz, because Ellison loves jazz and blues and is exposed to a lot of jazz and blues as he's growing up in Oklahoma, and he's correct in seeing that in The Wasteland. Although and he made it his business to try to go to all the sources that Eliot quotes so copiously and exasperatingly in The Wasteland. Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, T.S. Eliot, Hemingway he loves, although he will have to come to terms at some point with the fact that as much as he adores Hemingway, Hemingway does not write about race. In the few instances Hemingway wrote about black people, it's in a disparaging way. And Hemingway, in a sense, exemplifies what the way the core reading of Ralph, where American literature was concerned, and American culture. And that is that in the middle of the 19th century, with people like Ralph Waldo, Emerson, and Melville, and Whitman, and others, there was a powerful moral sense There's part and parcel involved with American writing. And the Negro was a figure of the nobility of man. Am I not a brother and a man? And people were willing to die for, not out of pure love of black people, but the blacks were symbolic of humanity. This was a moment, a great moment, and he saw American literature thereafter as a kind of decline, except for people like Mark Twain, and then in the 20th century in particular, William Faulkner, who was one of his, also in the pantheon. Hemingway, he had to come to terms. Andre Malraux and James Joyce, of course, as the great modernists. What were Ralph's core beliefs? They're important because they have to do, I think, with the problems that he encounters later on trying to be a writer. He believes in, and this comes out of his love of the wasteland, where Eliot draws on the whole idea of the importance of myth and symbol in culture, and quotes from the members of the Cambridge School of Myth and Symbol, including most famously Jessie Weston in the poem. He believes in mythic and symbolic ways of writing. He believes in surrealism. What he does not believe in, what he is repudiating, is the kind of direct, brutal realism of Richard Wright. He wants an art that is much more complicated and sophisticated. He's putting himself up against not the local competition, not Richard Wright, not his other relatives. He's putting himself up against the greatest of all writers. He doesn't know if he's going to be able to make that, to make an impression, but that is his goal. The ambition was absolutely out of this world. I should say that about this business of relatives and ancestors, that I have always looked askance at that distinction he makes, and because I think you have to be very careful in dealing with anyone, man or woman, who prefers his ancestors or her ancestors to her relatives. Ancestors are out there somewhere. Relatives challenge you on a daily basis, your humanity, your capacity for affection, and so on. So between 42 and 45, he's involved in the war. He's against the war, but he serves in the Merchant Marine. He makes a breakthrough as a writer in a short story, Flying Home. And then in 1945 in Waitsfield, Vermont, after 2 failed attempts to get a novel going, he stumbles upon I Am an Invisible Man. I think he had been writing a story about an invisible man, or a black man as invisible before. There's evidence of that. But getting that sentence into his head just bespoke and bespeaks a whole world of literary connection. I am an invisible man. So many great books in American literature have used the I form, the first person form. Although Henry James, of course, warned about it and said it led to baggy monsters of novels. But Call Me Ishmael, or or Gatsby, or You Don't Know Me, but I Done Told the Truth mainly in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And or coming down to the great novel that comes the year after Invisible Man, I Am an American, Chicago-born, Saul Bellow, another friend of Ellison's. Again, using the American eye, the Whitmanian eye. I mean, if you go back to that middle period of the 19th century in the great moral sense, Whitman is the greatest poet to ever lived in America, I would say, and the I is so very important. I sing myself and celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. I am an invisible man. Call me Ishmael. They're part, and of course some tropes from Melville are present right there. Let me speed on. He marries Rose Poindexter. That marriage fails. He is not one to be dominated, and he described her at one point lovingly as being full of piss and vinegar. And then he meets Fanny McConnell, who is and marries her eventually, and they live together for 50 years or so. And she is his great support. She is in some respects, a Chicago princess, some people say a South Side princess. She is educated, I would agree. She's organized, she has a steady job, and she absolutely believes in his genius. The other person who believes absolutely in his genius is Ida Espen Guggenheimer, who is an old woman, we would have said in those days, at that time, a little wild, but wealthy, dedicated to communism, but dedicated to a whole range of social issues and interests. She is the co-founder of Hadassah, the Jewish women's organization. She helps bring emigres from Nazism into the United States. She is interested in the rights of workers. She's interested in civil rights. And she, in a way, she supplants Ralph's mother in some respects. It's not the money I think he was into. I mean, when you read her letters to him, when he sends her a story or two, and it's a good story. I mean, it's just this sense of you are a great man. You're a great writer. The world will celebrate you soon. This confidence, this encouragement, and no wonder then that although Fanny Ellison, gave sweat and blood and worked hard and intellectually and in other ways supported Ralph for the 7 years he produced Invisible Man, he ended up dedicating the book to Ida. Ironically, which I think I have never understood that, or rather I have never accepted that. I mean, I think that Ida's assistance I don't think was important, as significant as was Fanny's, and I think it is part of Ralph's something or the other that he should. As far as I am concerned, slap his wife in the face in this way. That's just my point of view. But ironically, Ida Espen Guggenheimer was so upset by the way he portrays the Brotherhood, which most people see as the Communist Party, in his book, that they moved apart. I mean, she just withdrew from him. She saw it as a betrayal of beliefs that he had once held very dearly, and that she continued to hold. Perhaps I'm going to have somebody with a hook pull me and tell me when to stop. Invisible Man appears in 1952. He gets wonderful reviews. His work is compared, and I have a list of names invoked, great writers invoked in talking about him. There are caveats, of course. People say, well, the surrealism doesn't work. Well, it kind of, it loses itself in certain places. But it is talked about as a work that absolutely achieves the goal, the central goal that I would say that Ralph tried to achieve. He wanted to write a novel about black culture, but he wanted, in its interaction with white culture and interaction with other forms of black culture, but he also wanted to create a universal story. He wanted the Invisible Man, a person I call Invisible. He wanted Invisible to stand not only for every black man coming out of the South, sort of ignorant and whatnot, and coming to New York and being involved in industrialism and political ideology and black nationalism and so on. He wanted to create a kind of everyman outside of race. And insofar as someone like Invisible, in his lack of understanding of the world, his wrestling with questions of identity and of power and so on, is representative of people everywhere. Ellison achieved his goal, and lots of writers praised him very, very, very highly. When you think, well, how can Invisible stand for all of people? When people ask me that, I said, just remember what Henry David Thoreau said. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, or they think of themselves as invisible, and they are wrapped up in dramas of senses of failure and so on. Anyway, he does achieve that. 1953 comes the National Book Award, and that is crucial to him. This is America, and after all, and what really makes Ralph Ellison is not the novel, but the winning of this very prestigious award in 1953. He beats out Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, National Book Award, 4-1, the jury. But this is 53. It's the 54 comes the following year. Invisible, the Brown versus Board of Education, when the world of blacks and whites begins to be transformed. Opportunities unfold for blacks, and they unfold for Ellison in a spectacular way. And eventually he would become, I would say, for a certain period, say a 10-year period, the most powerful writer in America, the most publicly powerful writer in America. He would eventually win 2 presidential medals, one from LBJ, under whose patronage, with whose patronage he achieves his highest levels of it's not grand power, but it is a kind of power to be on a group of 5 helping to develop public television, for example, or on the board of the Kennedy Center in Washington. I mean, he is looked to, and he's especially looked to when shortly afterwards, after Brown, there begins the kind of rolling thunder that would lead to the explosion of black power starting around 1965, to which Ellison is absolutely opposed. And standing on his ideas of the iniquity, if you like, of the idea of racial separation. He considers himself a race man, but he does not at all believe in racial separateness. He does not believe in racial essentialism. What he does believe in is the greatness of America. And he believes in an America in which black people must know that they are part white, and white people must know that they are part black. I mean, those ideas are essential to him. And as the pressure grows, I mean, he comes to begins to talk about the sacred documents of American culture, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. These are sacred documents, he says, and they have to be respected as such. And people of good faith and of good intelligence will cling to these documents and the ideas and ideals enshrined in them, rather than give in to the kind of chaos. And chaos was a big word for him, as exemplified by the Black Power movement as far as he was concerned. He rises, as I've said, he gets on various boards. He becomes influential in the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He becomes very influential in the Century Club in New York, which is a leading club for people connected to the arts. He was a beloved member, drank a ton of martinis. He had a bit of a drinking problem, did his best to keep the old values alive. For example, made sure that for a while no women were admitted. And when they were admitted, they were not admitted with his assistance. In fact, Morrison said he never said hello, and she was admitted. He never said, "I should not be saying these things." I forget. This is too late. Tony, forgive me for talking your business out loud. But anyway, he does oppose the admission of women. And then there is this schism between Ralph and the younger black writers. There's that moment when he becomes a figure of scorn on college campuses. There's that moment in Grinnell where somebody just denounces him. "You're nothing but an Uncle Tom," and he breaks down, according to reliable witnesses, Willie Morrison, also a federal judge, a future federal judge, and sobs in tears on a young man's shoulder. Says, "I'm not an Uncle Tom. I am not an Uncle Tom. I simply have a set of beliefs, principles, in other words, that from your point of view might make me an Uncle Tom, but from my point of view respect the truths of history and the truths of American history, the truths of culture, and the finest truths of life itself." But that was a hard sell. He helped very few people. No author is obliged to help. No one is obliged to help anyone, I suppose, and no author is supposed to obliged to help younger people. But his unwillingness to help younger black writers just stood out. Somebody said to me when I said this recently, "Oh, but he helped, who was it? Leon Forrest." I said, yes, well, he helped Leon Forrest because Toni Morrison was Leon Forrest's editor. And she called him up and said, well, this is in the book, so I suppose I can just talk about it. She said, I'd like you, Leon Forrest worships you. I'd like you to do an introduction to his first book. And he said, I never do such things. And she said, yes, that's why it'll have a greater impact. She had his measure. She says of him in the book that that if somebody had said to him, would you like to meet this young black woman? She's quite good looking and very brilliant, future novelist, and so not future novelist, but maybe she had already published a novel. Would you like to meet her? He would have said no. She was sure about that, even though his editor, who was also Faulkner's editor toward the end, and was very friendly to her. This was his Olympian sense. There's a story too of in Rome, and a certain woman whose name you would recognize, African American, comes visiting the American Academy, and she sees the great Ralph Ellison, sitting there by himself, and she takes a tray and goes over and sits down next to him, and as she's sitting down, he's rising up with his back turned towards her and walking away. That is the truth. That is who he was. But he was, of course, much more than that. He was a great artist. He has left behind a magnificent, transcendently magnificent novel. I would say that the stories not the stories, but the essays in Shadow and Act, published in 1964, and then later some in Going to the Territory in the 80s. But Shadow and Act, I would say, is the finest, is the greatest set of essays on black culture, especially where one is talking about black expressive culture, the blues and jazz, and the realities of Harlem life and so on. To me, it rivals The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois's masterpiece of 1903. But you did have this. The irony was that Ralph was keeping the younger writers at arm's length, especially the younger women writers at arm's length, and that was presented a true problem because black women's writing took on a powerful a form of its own and a power unto itself that would end, of course, in the awarding of a Nobel Prize for Literature to a woman, and the sort of eclipsing of Ralph as numero uno in American literature. So he separated himself from those people. But the irony is that they read his work and they found in Invisible Man and in Shadow and Act, in the ideas espoused in Shadow and Act, Paul Marshall, who is as fine a black woman novelist as there is, said, this book was my Bible. And others have said the same thing. Toward the end of his life, there was a kind of coming together. He began to understand and accept the reality of black life as the century closed, was that there was no one among the younger artists, or very few, I should say, among the younger artists, who were prepared to live without some element of cultural nationalism in their blood. Those days, the days of measuring yourself simply by the eyes in the eyes of whites, as Du Bois said, those days were gone forever. At the same time, as Irving Howe, who was white but who read the younger black writers and wrote about them, he said, they are cosmopolitan. And Ralph was always talking about how shabby the standards of art were. Langston Hughes's terrible work, but also the work of the younger writers, Nikki Giovanni, terrible, or Ishmael Reed, not even worth reading. But Howard said, and it's quite true, they also are perfectionists and experimentalists and futurists in their writing. They have the very, very high standards. They are cosmopolitan. They simply are also devoted to the idea of themselves as black people having a special history and a special sense of responsibility. There was as the years went by, the business of the unproduced novel became more and more embarrassing to him, harrowing to him, I would say. He had a fire, his country home in the Berkshires burns down in 1967, and he uses that as an excuse. Increasingly, the story of the burning of the papers takes on. You'd think eventually that it was like the conflagration that that destroyed the library at Alexandria. In fact, by not very careful, not very assiduous research, I mean, I discover that I see that in fact he has lost very, very little. But at some point, he's talking about having lost 365, nice number, pages of manuscript, and Mrs. Ellison is talking about having seen the manuscript through a window, but being restrained by the firemen as she wanted to reach well, it was an issue for him, a problem for him. Materially, he did fairly well, which is an important matter. I mean, did he end up, and his family end up on Skid Row, as it were? No, nothing like that. He was able to go to the end, affording the creature comforts that he liked, the few of them that he liked. And how do we measure him finally? I think. Again, one has to remember, after everything has been said about his character and his behavior, one has to remember that this is a great artist we are talking about, and a great art exacts a toll on the artist and exacts a toll on the people around the artist. They often pay a steeper price as the artist pays himself. Some people, Houston A. Baker Jr., for example, has written about him as a clubbable monster, clubbable in the sense that, I mean, what was more important to him in the 60s and 70s during the Black Power age was to sit in the Century Club and with a martini in his hand and talk to powerful white folks and explain why, why this sort of thing was going on. Other people were also censorious. Toni Morrison has written that, in summary, in a way, Ralph's career had produced, quote, a spectacular novel, elegant essays, international respect, and yet one is tempted to say also that it is tinged with tragedy, because expectations of much more fictional work were never realized. But tragedy is not the right word. It requires grandeur. Tragedy requires grandeur. The better word is melancholy. One contrasts the largeness of Invisible Man with its broad canvas and its wide range of effects, of insight, with the narrowness of his public encounter with blacks. The contemporary world of late 20th century African Americans was largely inaccessible or simply uninteresting to him as a creative fiction. For him, in essence, the eye, the gaze of the beholder remained white. And so on, so she goes. And I quote at the end of a range of people, Stanley Crouch, for example, who loved Ralph and who talked to him incessantly on the telephone and so on, but who also recognized that, as he put it, Saul Bellow told me once that Ralph's problem was that he had this ethnic desire on behalf of blacks or Negro people to have a black writer create literature at the level of Faulkner, Hemingway, or even Melville. This is Saul Bellow, who knew Ralph quite well at a certain point. Unfortunately, Crouch added, Ralph had decided to give himself the assignment. He should have chosen some other Negro, perhaps. So there. Let me end there with this. Having heard from two or three of these people who are entitled by their superior literary accomplishment and so on and mentality, this idea of this being in a sense a sad story. In some respects, this is a cautionary tale. If you read about his relationship with his wife, especially. He was not a man. He was no woman chaser, but he managed to turn two affairs during his extramarital affairs, the only two that I think he had, into really, really severe tests of his wife's sanity, out of a kind of mixture of. Well, let me not go there. You should buy the book and either now or when it is remanded. I'm absolutely indifferent, and I've lost the train of my thought there. And so that perhaps is a good place to close. I ended up glad that I had put out put the effort out. One of the most interesting things about the reaction. A lot of younger people are writing to say, and younger women in particular, scholars, I mean, and scholars even of age just younger than mine, to say, we are so glad you did not write, just a book of praise. Ellison has received enough praise, enough with the grandeur, enough with the Olympian standards. You know, you've broken new ground with this honesty. It's a sad story. It's a cautionary tale. We love Invisible Man. We love Shadow and Act and so on. But the truth had to be told, and I'm encouraged by the idea, the thought expressed by a number of people who have written to me that this comes close to the human truth of Ralph Ellison. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do.
And if anybody wants a book, I don't mean to be crassly commercial, but if you want a book and you buy a book and want it signed, I mean, I'd be happy to sign it in your absence if you can find some way of getting it once you have gone back to your job or whatever it is you want to go back to, or sign it in your presence if you wish to wait around. But are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you mentioned this agreement you made. You signed with his wife for them to review your
Yes.
manuscript. And, so what was their assessment of your realistic?
Very, very good question. Excellent question. Oh, the question is, I signed an agreement saying that the estate, Mrs. Ellison, had she been alive at the end, had the right to review the manuscript, comment on it, although she couldn't dictate what ended up in the book. Well, in fact, John Callahan, the literary executor, was extraordinarily valuable. Especially in his explosions of anger about some of the things I had written in the manuscript. And I think that he made the book much better because, you're alone, you're creating a book, a story, and you lose a sense of proportion, perhaps. And he was there speaking, as it were, for Ralph, but speaking also as a distinguished literary professor for the best standards of biography, for a certain kind of caution, a certain kind of subtlety. So I would say that the agreement, and that was my idea really, although perhaps they would have thought of it too, proved to be very helpful in the end because of the strong criticism by John Callahan, who eventually, with modifications and so on, accepted the manuscript as a worthy piece of work. Yes.
Did he have any pronounced religious or philosophical beliefs, such as existentialism?
He had no religious beliefs. His mother was very religious. He explicitly said that his funeral service was to have no religious overtone. Although Nathan Scott, a friend of his and who was a professor of religion at UVA, and before that at Chicago, did read from the Book of Common Prayer, the committal, at his funeral, where the speakers were William Styron, Leon Forrest, Michael Harper read some poems, and that was it. So the very secular stuff. As for philosophical beliefs, one could not say that he believed in existentialism or so, but he was well read in existentialism, and one of his discoveries, his tasks. I don't know exactly how to put it. Certainly, as he is working out the ideas behind Invisible Man, is the linkage between European, the elements of linkage between European existentialism and the African-American, the classic African-American condition, as exemplified by the blues. He reads Sartre, certainly, although it is in magazines mainly for the beginning. He reads Unamuno, and that's important to him. He reads the existentialists, yes, and you'd have to say that it's almost is an existential novel, right? In many respects, yes. Okay, all right.
I'm really, really fascinated by your discussion about the book as well as the book. But I wanted to ask you, did your work on Ellison and the biography direct you or inform you or influence any way your work on Richard Wright's work or Du Bois' work? Was there any connection?
Well, they would have had to. It would have. The direction would have been opposite. In working on Ellison, as I think I said before, I mean, I just come off of working with Langston. But to be perfectly honest, and why not be honest on C-SPAN, I had to face the fact that although I loved Langston and he taught me a great deal, although I am not, as a reviewer has said, I was not reverential to Langston Hughes in my biography. I put everything out there that was bad that I could find about Langston. I had to face the fact that in some respects I was more like Ellison than I was like Langston. But that was neither here nor there. The important thing was to achieve a kind of distance and balance and harmony, and not make the book be an unsuitable reflection of my own ideas. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes, considering the time the book was published, 1952, the Cold War is really heated up. At this
Yes.
time. I wanted to ask you exactly how did the fact that Ellison turned his back on Brother Jack and the Brotherhood,
Yes.
which essentially is saying no to communism for
Yes.
blacks, and that was a major concern at the time that
Mhm.
blacks
Yes.
would go communist, of course, and that even during the civil rights movement with King, that was always a concern.
Yes.
Exactly. How do you think that affected? It's a great novel. It's one of the great novels.
How did the Cold War?
How did that affect the reception of the novel?
How did the Cold War affect the reception of the novel? Yes, that's the question. But I think also important is how did it affect the writing of the novel? Some of the truly savage reviews of Invisible Man, and there were savage reviews, came from the black communist press. As, for example, black people need Invisible Man like they need a hole in the head. Or even non-communist, J. Saunders Redding said, this is an elephant spent to however long, many years gestation takes, and then produced a gnat. There's a nothing book, and on all sides he was profoundly criticized by. But how did it affect the book itself? I think that it had to have affected the ending of Invisible Man, because he goes into the hole and he's down there and he's doing his stuff and so on. And then there's the epilogue, and the epilogue is all about the infinite possibilities of life, of America, and so on. And I'm coming out, I'm coming forth, the optimism. I think he would have been, rather foolish or extraordinarily brave, depending on his true feelings, in not to have been aware in 1952 of what had happened and was happening to people like Du Bois, who was handcuffed at one point, and so on. What had happened to Robeson, and since Ralph was really very firmly anti-communist, so it's almost kind of coldly dismissive of the comrades he had once known, it seems to me that he would have wanted to underscore the fact, from a professional point of view, that he had no ties whatsoever, no sympathies whatsoever for communism. And I think that perhaps shaped the book. Perhaps it shaped the vehemence of his attitude of denunciation of the Brotherhood or the party, and perhaps it also shaped the optimistic note on which it ends. Although I think the optimistic note on which it ends is probably the proper way to end. The more artistically, structurally, it is a finer way to end than to have it just simply, fade out into a kind of existential gloom.
Could I quickly ask you what led to his break with the Communist Party?
Well, the communists, at a certain point, they had been very hot on the Negro question, and then you had the Soviet Union entering the war. And suddenly there was a decision. Well, we want the white South. We want the white masses with us. We cannot push this is a reduction of a gross reduction of their position, no doubt. But they definitely decided to downplay their interest in civil rights. And Ellison took it and many blacks took it as a kind of betrayal of blacks. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that his relationship with Richard Wright and Langston Hughes was that he did not think much of the writings of Richard Wright and Langston Hughes. I would like to know what did Langston Hughes and Richard Wright think of his writing?
Well, Langston Hughes was so generous. I'm probably going to have to ask you to repeat the question. What did Langston Hughes and Richard Wright think of Ellison's writing? Langston praised the book to the skies in his column in the Chicago Defender, saying, and had always been Ellison's champion. Praised it to the skies. He did not mention that he hadn't read the book. And he did complain about the density of the book and the difficulty. So Langston, there's some element to the truth that his intellectual range was, I would say, deliberately narrow in some respects. He wanted a more direct kind of communication with black people than is to be found in Invisible Man. Richard Wright, Ralph had to recognize the greatness of Native Son, but he would have thought of it as a greatness of a certain kind. It's a tragic story in some respects because Wright goes into exile, and that is, from my point of view, a huge mistake. And Ellison, who refuses to go into exile, refuses to go to Europe. I'm an American. I'm staying right here. I'm too stubbornly American. I'm staying right here. And Wright's career certainly never achieves again the prominence of Black Boy in 1945, where he sells 240,000 copies and writes one of the classics of American autobiography. So there comes that moment when he receives Invisible Man, sent to him by Ralph, and he acknowledges receipt of it, and then he doesn't say anything about it for several months. And then he sends a letter that, for most part, is kind of perfunctory. And then he says, well, you certainly made a name for yourself. I mean, clearly there was an element of just, understandable envy or regret or whatever you want to put it. And Ralph waited just as long to say, I've got your letter. You really should come back. People do still talk about you, kind of thing. So there was that wariness there. But Ralph insisted that that one should not overstate the importance of Wright to his career. Well, I think the importance was palpable. It's there, very important to his career.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.